Hi everyone, my name's Edwin. I am really interested in problem solving and optimizing personal effectiveness, specifically using the ideas of David Deutsch and more broadly the philosophy of critical rationalism. Now, over the past weeks, we've been going through several parts of the problem solving process and considering how our default processes work and how we can optimize our own decision making and problem solving. Last week, we discussed coming up with various solutions to a potential problem, and this week, we're going to focus on choosing between the solutions. Now, to do so, we're going to discuss like the default way that our minds would make a decision, and in describing that, we'll also identify some pitfalls where it can often go wrong, and also of course how we can circumvent that. Now, specifically, there is two parts where this can go wrong, and the first part, and one we'll start with, is acting too quickly. So we have a set of solutions that we conjectured or came up with, and then there has to be obviously a decision made of what to do. And sometimes we just will instinctively choose one and go with it a bit too soon. The reason this happens is because we have actually a lot of problems that we do act on automatically. So for instance, like we don't think about having to breathe or to walk and beat our hearts. You know, there's a lot of our behaviors that are in fact innate, so they're unconscious drives. They just happen automatically, and a lot of these we cannot even intervene with. And that leads to this mistaken conception that maybe this is one of those things that I cannot intervene with and I should just let it go. This can occur in a couple of ways. I think I'll give two examples, one with an intuition and one with a drive. Starting with a drive, I think this is probably a common situation where you've probably met some person who says, "Well, yeah, I just saw red. I was just so angry. I couldn't help myself. I couldn't constrain myself. I just had to let it out." So then they're basically saying the feelings or the unconscious drive that were signaling the feelings made me so overwhelmed with emotion. I just had to act. There was no way in which I could intervene. That's just how I'm wired. I'm a hothead, etc. This is, of course, foregoing of human agency in the fact that we don't have to act on our drives. Even if they're super powerful, there are still ways that we can intervene and take a moment and like consider if it's really the right way to go. Second way that this could happen, it's when we have an intuition that we have usually conditioned ourselves to believe. So we may be under the impression that, oh, I'm just a quiet person. I don't like speaking up in meetings, so I'm just gonna sit back and relax. So, for instance, you're in a meeting with colleagues at work and someone asks, does anybody have any ideas to solve this problem? And you do have ideas, but actually your default process is like, I'm not a quote-unquote extrovert, or I'm not someone who would speak up, and this is not gonna come consciously in those words to your mind, but it's going to be a feeling and an intuition that you could express in words, and you do kind of know what's going on, but it is very subtle. So we often condition ourselves to believe we are a certain way or not a certain way, and personality tests really do a bad job at reinforcing these kinds of limiting beliefs, where we think we are a certain way and therefore we should just automatically let the solution that comes to our mind, in this case not doing anything, take the reins. In other cases, you know, it might be the opposite, right? Where you have a colleague at work, you know, who just always will fill up the space and give ideas, even though they have no really sense of a good solution for this problem. But they're just this type of person that have made themselves believe, I am the smartest, so I just always should say something, and the other people are not saying something, so they're probably not smart as me, etc. These are all beliefs that we've unconsciously internalized. And I think it's really important to introspect and to question, hey, is this really one of those automatic situations where I cannot or should not intervene and just let what kind of I sense take over? In some regards, that might be a good solution. For instance, if you have a very emotionally healthy way to approach with problems and someone says something negative to you and you just brush it off, sure, then go with your initial solution that pops in your mind. You're just going about your day and not caring about it. But in other cases, it might be very limiting beliefs that we've adopted that are causing more friction and also leading us to make worse decisions. So now we've covered the first common mistake we make, which is to act too quickly and just assume it's an instinctive response that is required by the situation, whereas we could actually exercise our agency and intervene and not let limiting beliefs or overwhelming feelings take the wheel. So the second stage is where there is actually conscious weighing of options going on in our mind, where we're deciding which ones are the right ones and which ones are the wrong ones. And here too lies a pitfall that we can often run into, namely that is we have, for the majority of our decisions in daily life, we rely on mental shortcuts, or cognitive biases they're also often called, which are just mechanisms to oversimplify a situation so that it's quick to know what is the option that is satisfactory in the moment and just go with that. This is very useful. We need this type of biases or mental shortcuts to make our routine decisions, because we just have so many. There's no way we could ever do it all with like a conscious, meticulous process of defining a problem and defining success criteria and then coming up with solutions, etc. That would be too slow and also probably painful to go through life in this way. So we have these mental shortcuts, but they are not foolproof. They're very fallible, and there's actually a lot of literature on this. Namely, the work of Daniel Kahneman and Amos Tversky is very interesting on this. They researched cognitive biases and mental shortcuts and decision making for decades. Daniel Kahneman wrote a really great book, which is a popular science book called Thinking Fast and Slow, in which he really breaks down the inside of their research and gives some very practical explanations that can be applied in daily life. So, to briefly explain what a mental shortcut is, it is a oversimplification of a situation. So there's a lot of things going on, there's a lot of past actions going on, maybe some future predictions as well in the situation. But what the mental shortcuts do is they say, no, these are the key factors, here's the information, deal with it. So they oversimplify a situation to make it very easy to kind of weigh which one options are the better ones. This is the basic mechanism they all use. There are many different ones. I'll go through a couple of examples. The first one is the negativity bias, where we are overly sensitive to negative news in contrast to positive news or positive ideas, because simply in nature, when something is potentially harmful or bad, it's better to be overly cautious of that and to be overly fearful of that, because the risk is that it will literally kill you, and therefore like the game is over. Whereas something positive, it can never kill you. It will just be like, it can be good or it can be great. That is less dangerous for survival in the gene pool. So therefore we are more sensitive to that negative emotion. You see that also in news, like all the news headlines are like 99% is all negative and doom and gloom. And we're just overly sensitive to this also in our decision making. So we will overvalue negative options, potentially risky options, more so than it's actually realistic. Another thing that we often fall into is this thing called survivorship bias, where we only will see the examples walking around that made it, that are successful, or that are proof that it can work, and assume that, okay, there's this N is one instance of it working out, therefore it's trivial, simple, anybody could do it. But you do not see the 99.99% who tried and were even more capable but just didn't make it due to other factors like sheer luck. So the survivorship bias also makes us overvalue what we see in reality as opposed to like what went on behind the scenes to get there. And the third bias that we often encounter is overconfidence. We will sense that we are overconfident in a situation, or at least very confident to make decisions and to act quickly, just because nature suggests at least you make a move and you make some action. It's a lot better than being passive and again risk being taken out. So therefore this sense of like urgency and like, okay, we know what we're doing, we're just gonna make a decision, etc. That is quite prevalent in our genes as well. So these were like 3 of the biases, but there's actually many more. So that does beg the question, what can we do about these cognitive biases or these mental shortcuts? If they're so error prone and they're flawed in many situations, how do we deal with them? Well, we could, in theory, override them. So what we can do is like create habits and make sure those habits trigger a situation that our biases would also be triggered, and that would basically outcompete the signal of the bias and give us therefore a better bias or a better mental shortcut in that situation. We could do that, but what Tversky and Kahneman found was that it's incredibly hard and therefore also infeasible or impractical to do in daily life, because it just there's just so many of these biases. They're extremely entrenched, so we've used them many times and reinforced them many times that it's just hard to overcome. And there's also just so many situations in which they arise. It's very hard to create these mental shortcuts that would override all those situations. So it's a possible angle, and it's not like there's no law of nature that's forbidding it and therefore we can't do it, but it's impractical. And instead what they suggest or offer is the idea that you take note of a situation. If it's a serious situation in which cognitive bias or mental shortcuts are likely to be wrong, to notice that and then just pause and use your deliberate and conscious reasoning instead. I also think this is probably the more feasible way to go about it, and this is also what I would recommend in decision making. However, using our conscious reasoning does lead to a third trap, which is overthinking, where we are just spending way too much time and effort on weighing all the options mechanically and competing them against each other, putting them against each other, seeing which one is better in this regard and that regard, and just taking so much time that it's almost beside the point. I mean, there's a sweet spot for like, okay, I want a solution that is probably gonna solve my problem, but I don't want to spend too much time on it because it's also taking away time from a next problem that I could be working on. So there's opportunity cost involved as well here. And that's what we need to worry about when we're using our cognitive thinking processes and try not to overthink. I won't go into specific techniques on how to do that right now, but perhaps in a later video, if you think that's interesting, I could do that. It's also heavily featured in the book in a couple of the chapters on decision making. But for today, that was the topic that I wanted to discuss. What we discussed first was when we take action too quickly. So when we act instinctively and we think we have no control, or we think it's just a routine task, but it's actually not the case. What we can do then is, again, pause and think, is this really a helpful situation? Is there a limiting belief at play or not? And the other circumstance we discussed was making decisions, but using a bit too much of our mental shortcuts. And in those situations, we have to really identify when mental shortcuts are good to use, and if they are not good to use, we should just go for our conscious knowledge and our deliberate reasoning and criticize our ideas that way. Alright, thank you for listening. If you want to know a bit more about critical rationalism and the worldview of David Deutsch, I highly recommend his book, The Beginning of Infinity. If you want to know more about the mental shortcuts and how this works and all of the research that Daniel Kahneman and Amos Tversky have done, I would recommend reading Thinking Fast and Slow. It's really one of my favorite books. I highly recommend it because it will really help you also see when other people are tripping up or when you're likely to trip up. It's a very interesting book. And if you like what I spoke about today, consider subscribing to the channel or signing up for the waitlist for my book, which is on my website. Links to everything are below. Thank you for watching again and have a great day.